It was a crime that stunned the nation. 4 bright young university students brutally murdered in the dead of night in the safety of their own home. The small, close-knit community of Moscow, Idaho was shattered, its sense of security forever broken. In the weeks that followed, the search for answers turned into a national obsession. But as the investigation unfolded, the spotlight turned to a quiet, unassuming criminology student. How did Bryan Kohberger go from studying crime to standing accused of one of the most horrific murders in recent memory? What investigators would uncover behind closed doors would send shockwaves far beyond this quiet town. Hey, True Crime Secrets family, a huge thank you for your support. Your views and comments mean everything to us. We're committed to bringing you daily, gripping true crime stories that keep you on the edge of your seat. Your feedback has shaped this channel, and we're just getting started. If you haven't subscribed yet, make sure to hit that button so you don't miss out. Thanks again for being part of the journey. Stay curious, stay safe, and keep uncovering the secrets. On the surface, Bryan Kohberger appeared to be just another graduate student. A young man fascinated by the study of criminal behavior, he enrolled in a rigorous criminology program at Washington State University, located just a short drive from the University of Idaho. Professors described him as reserved but intelligent, a student who delved deeply into the complexities of criminal psychology. He wasn't the type to stand out in a crowd, and certainly not the type you'd expect to see at the center of a nationwide investigation. But this story isn't just about Bryan Kohberger. It's also about the lives that were lost. 4 bright young students at the start of their journeys. Kaylee Goncalves was the spark of every room she entered, a senior with big dreams and a heart full of kindness. Madison Mogan, her best friend since childhood, shared those dreams. They were inseparable, 2 halves of a lifelong friendship that seemed unbreakable. Ethan Chapin, a freshman, was known for his infectious laughter and his love of sports. A triplet, he shared a unique bond with his siblings, and his future seemed as bright as the smile he always wore. Zana Kernodle, Ethan's girlfriend, was determined and full of life, a young woman who approached every challenge with strength and grace. Together, they were just ordinary college students, sharing memories, late-night study sessions, and dreams of what lay ahead. Their home, a rental near campus, was a place of joy and laughter, where friends gathered and life unfolded as it does for students everywhere. But no one could have imagined how abruptly those lives would be cut short. The tight-knit community of Moscow, Idaho was about to face a tragedy it would never forget. Moscow, Idaho, a picturesque college town nestled in the rolling hills of the Palouse. With its tree-lined streets, cozy cafes, and the warmth of a tight-knit community, it was the kind of place where doors were often left unlocked and neighbors greeted each other by name. For the students at the University of Idaho, it was more than a town. It was a second home, a backdrop for late-night study sessions, football games, and lifelong friendships. But on November 13th, 2022, the serenity of this quiet community was shattered. Early that morning, police responded to a chilling 911 call. What they found inside a modest, off-campus rental house would haunt investigators for months to come. 4 students, all brutally murdered, their lives cut short in a way that defied comprehension. As the news spread, disbelief turned to fear. How could something like this happen here? The details were scarce, the leads elusive, and the question on everyone's mind was the same: who could have done this, and why? The investigation that followed was unlike anything Moscow had ever seen. Police worked tirelessly to piece together the events of that night, but answers were hard to come by. Rumors and theories swirled in the absence of information, leaving a community desperate for justice. Inside the house, investigators found troubling signs. The scene spoke of violence, but there was no forced entry. This raised unsettling questions. Had the killer been someone the victims knew, someone they trusted? Outside, neighbors reported hearing little, if anything, unusual that night. For weeks, the case seemed to be at a standstill. Then, a breakthrough. Surveillance footage captured a white Hyundai Elantra near the scene at the time of the murders. Investigators traced the car to a graduate student living just across the state line in Pullman, Washington. His name was Bryan Kohberger. At first glance, Kohberger seemed an unlikely suspect. He was studying for a PhD in criminology, focusing on the very subject of criminal behavior. But as investigators dug deeper, his academic interest in crime began to take on a more unsettling light. Questions about his involvement mounted. Could the man studying crime have also been its perpetrator? It was the evidence that began to unravel the mystery. A single strand of DNA recovered from a knife sheath left at the crime scene would prove to be a pivotal clue. The match led directly to Bryan Kohberger, tying him to the house in a way that was impossible to ignore. But the revelations didn't stop there. Investigators uncovered chilling details of Kohberger's movements on the night of the murders, pieced together from cell phone records and surveillance footage. His car was spotted circling the neighborhood multiple times, almost as if he were waiting for the perfect moment to strike. The evidence painted a harrowing picture of premeditation. And then there was his digital footprint. Online, Kohberger had participated in forums discussing violent crimes, sometimes in ways that suggested more than mere academic interest. Posts and surveys he conducted for his studies hinted at a fascination with the mindsets of offenders. By the time law enforcement moved to arrest Kohberger, the case against him was mounting. His trial became a spectacle, drawing national attention as new details emerged in the courtroom. And finally, after months of anticipation, the verdict was delivered, guilty on all counts. The verdict brought a measure of closure for the families and the community, but the pain of loss remains. For the families of Kaylee, Madison, Ethan, and Zana, the trial was just one step in a long journey of grief and remembrance. Moscow, Idaho, is no longer the same quiet town it once was. For its residents, the tragedy serves as a stark reminder of the fragility of safety and the unexpected darkness that can disrupt even the most peaceful of places. As for Bryan Kohberger, his name is now etched into the annals of criminal history, not as the student who sought to understand crime, but as the man who committed it. And so we're left with the haunting question: what drives someone to cross the line between observing crime and committing it? In this case, the answer may remain as elusive as the motives behind the act itself. For weeks, the investigation into the brutal murders in Moscow, Idaho seemed to stall. Leads dried up, and the community's collective anxiety deepened. With no arrests and no suspects, the case appeared to teeter on the edge of going cold. But just as frustration began to overtake hope, a breakthrough emerged, one that would change everything. It started with a seemingly ordinary piece of evidence, a knife sheath left behind at the scene. At first glance, it seemed unremarkable, an oversight by someone in a hurry. But hidden within its fibers, investigators found the clue they needed: a single strand of DNA. It was microscopic, almost invisible to the naked eye, but its discovery was monumental. The DNA didn't match anyone living in the house. Instead, it pointed to an individual no one had suspected, a graduate student living in the nearby town of Pullman. But how could a criminology student, someone who had dedicated his life to studying crime, possibly be involved in something like this? Investigators needed more than just a DNA match to answer that question, and so they dug deeper. What they found next would stun even the most seasoned detectives. The white Hyundai Elantra became a focus. Surveillance cameras captured the vehicle circling the area near the victim's house multiple times on the night of the murders. The movements were deliberate, calculated, and chilling in their precision. But the connection to Kohberger was tenuous. There were thousands of similar cars in the region. Was it coincidence, or was it something more? As investigators traced the vehicle, they uncovered a web of movements that seemed far too precise to ignore. Phone records revealed gaps, moments when Kohberger's cell phone was either turned off or in airplane mode, effectively rendering him invisible during the critical hours of the crime. It was as though someone had thought through every detail, every step, every potential way to avoid detection. But even the most meticulous plans leave room for error. Despite the mounting evidence, authorities needed more to secure an arrest. The DNA, the car, the phone records, they were compelling but circumstantial. Investigators feared they were one step away from watching their case unravel. Then came the final piece, the digital footprint. In a quiet corner of the internet, investigators found posts that painted a far darker picture of Bryan Kohberger. Surveys on criminal psychology, questions about the thought processes of offenders. But it wasn't just academic curiosity. It felt disturbingly personal. Could these posts have been the musings of someone reflecting on their own actions? Or were they simply the work of a student too immersed in his field? But before investigators could act, they were faced with a race against time. They knew the suspect might flee, change his routine, or worse, strike again. The moment to act had arrived. On a cold morning in December, a convoy of police vehicles descended on Kohberger's Pullman apartment. The arrest was swift, decisive, and shrouded in secrecy. Neighbors described the scene as surreal: flashing lights, tactical teams, and the figure of Bryan Kohberger, handcuffed and led away in silence. The community that had once been gripped by fear now watched in stunned disbelief as the face of their suspected killer was revealed. But even as he was taken into custody, questions lingered. What was his motive? How could someone who had spent years studying the intricacies of crime turn around and commit such an act? And most hauntingly of all, was there more to this story that no one yet understood? In the quiet hours of the night, when most of Moscow, Idaho was fast asleep, something unimaginable was unfolding in a house not far from the university. 4 young lives were lost, and the peaceful town would never be the same again. The question that lingered on everyone's mind: who could commit such a heinous act? Bryan Kohberger, a criminology graduate student, seemed as ordinary as anyone else, but as investigators began to peel back the layers, they discovered a chilling connection, one that no one could have anticipated. A criminologist who had studied the minds of criminals, yet somehow became the very person he sought to understand. But what would lead a student of crime to become its architect? The journey to uncovering the truth was anything but straightforward. Each step brought new revelations. Each discovery raised more questions. And with every question, the dark thread tying the suspect to the crime seemed to tighten. But there was always one more twist, one more hidden clue waiting to be uncovered. But as investigators combed through the crime scene, they knew the killer had left something behind, something crucial: a knife sheath. A seemingly trivial piece of evidence at first glance, but as the investigators looked closer, they discovered it was more than just a discarded item. Embedded in its fibers was a tiny, almost invisible clue, a strand of DNA so faint it could have been missed entirely, a strand that would ultimately lead them to a breakthrough. A match was made. The DNA didn't belong to anyone in the house. It belonged to Bryan Kohberger. But that discovery was just the beginning, and with it came a flood of questions. How could Kohberger, someone studying the minds of criminals, have been the perpetrator of such a crime? The evidence seemed to point to him, but it wasn't enough to make an arrest, yet. Police needed more, and soon they found it. The mystery deepened when Kohberger's vehicle, a white Hyundai Elantra, was traced to the area near the crime scene. Surveillance footage showed the car circling the block. Could it be a coincidence? Or was this a deliberate attempt to scout the house, to lay the groundwork for what would become one of the most shocking crimes in the country's history? Kohberger's actions seemed calculated, meticulous. He didn't just study crime, he was living it. And now law enforcement was starting to piece together a chilling portrait of the man who had meticulously planned the murders. Forensics can't lie. And just as investigators were closing in on Kohberger, a final piece of evidence emerged. But still, one question remained. Was Kohberger the mastermind, or was there more to this story that no one had yet uncovered? The arrest was made, but that didn't bring closure, at least not yet. The trial is ongoing, and each new day brings more revelations. What drives a man to study crime for years, only to become the very thing he sought to understand? The answers may come, but for now, the questions linger in the minds of those who are left behind. In the end, it's not just about the person who committed the crime. It's about the lives lost, the families shattered, and a community forever altered. The full story of Bryan Kohberger, the criminology student turned suspect, may never fully unfold. But the investigation is far from over. What does it take to understand the mind of a criminal? Bryan Kohberger spent years studying criminology, dissecting the psychology of offenders. But as the investigation unfolded, a chilling question began to emerge. Could his expertise in understanding crime have made him the perfect predator? Or was it the key to his undoing? Imagine being in the shoes of investigators, piecing together a jigsaw puzzle where every new discovery seemed more shocking than the last. Each detail uncovered only added layers to the mystery, leaving one question hauntingly unanswered. Why? Why would someone with such a promising future, someone who spent years studying the very crimes he would later commit, do such a thing? But as the evidence mounted, so did the tension. Was it really Kohberger's criminology background that helped him evade capture? Or was there something more to his story? How far did his obsession with crime go, and what lengths would he go to for his twisted experiment? As the investigation went on, it became clear that this wasn't just about a simple crime. Every step seemed like part of a dark plan, one that had been years in the making. Was Kohberger studying his own actions, rehearsing a future that would bring him face to face with his darkest thoughts? Or was he playing a dangerous game, thinking he could outsmart the very system he studied so intently? As the trial unfolds, we are left with more questions than answers. The chilling reality is that in many ways, Kohberger knew the system inside and out. He knew how to cover his tracks, how to evade detection, and how to study the very behavior that might have made him slip up. But here's something to consider. Kohberger wasn't the only one with a deep understanding of crime. What if the investigators had been just as prepared as he was? How much did Kohberger truly believe he was in control, and how much was he simply being caught in a trap of his own making? As we peel back the layers of this case, it's clear that the truth is far more complicated than it seemed at first. The investigation into Bryan Kohberger is far from over, and each revelation continues to raise even more chilling questions. But I want to hear from you. What do you think? What drove Kohberger to commit such an unfathomable act? Was it his background in criminology, or was it something else entirely? Leave your thoughts and theories in the comments below. I'll be reading and responding to the most intriguing ones. If you're as captivated by cases like this as I am, make sure to subscribe to our channel and hit the bell icon. That way, you'll never miss the next chapter of this chilling story. The investigation into Bryan Kohberger's role in the brutal murders shocked the nation. But there was something that no one could have anticipated. It wasn't just the grisly crime scene, nor the chilling evidence that pointed towards him. No. What left investigators and the public truly stunned was Kohberger's behavior in the aftermath. His cold, calculated demeanor would become the most unsettling part of the entire case. In interviews with investigators, Kohberger never once seemed rattled. His calm, almost eerily controlled responses were in stark contrast to the nature of the crime. It was as though he was playing a part, as though he was the one who had the upper hand, guiding the investigation instead of being the one under suspicion. What was even more chilling was his willingness to discuss the very thing he had been studying for years, the psychology of crime. But this wasn't just about what he said, it was the way he said it. Investigators noted his chilling nonchalance when discussing the murders, almost as though he was detached from the very crime that had stolen 4 young lives. Some believe that Kohberger's criminology studies didn't just make him an observer of crime, it may have made him feel as though he was above it. Could it be that his extensive knowledge of criminal behavior made him think he could outsmart law enforcement? Or did it feed into a much darker obsession? It was the way Kohberger responded to questions that threw investigators off balance. He wasn't frantic. He wasn't defensive. Instead, he was unnervingly composed, almost too composed. It was the way Kohberger responded to questions that threw investigators off balance. He wasn't frantic. He wasn't defensive. Instead, he was unnervingly composed, almost too composed. For the victims' families, it was unfathomable. How could someone who had studied crime so meticulously, someone who had spent years learning about the minds of killers, commit such a horrific act? But even more chilling than the crime itself was the psychology behind it. Kohberger's understanding of criminal behavior, of how the mind works, may have led him to believe he could commit the perfect crime, one that would remain unsolved, one where he could remain untouchable. As investigators continued to piece together the evidence, it became clear that Kohberger's knowledge of crime wasn't just academic. It seemed to bleed into his actions. His interviews, his behavior, even his very presence at the scene seemed calculated, a chilling reflection of the mind behind the murders. But the questions lingered. Was he a victim of his own obsession? Or was he more calculating than anyone could have ever imagined? The twists in this case weren't just found in the evidence. They were found in the mind of Bryan Kohberger himself. And as the investigation continues, we are left with one lingering question. How much of this case was planned, and how much was driven by something far more disturbing? Bryan Kohberger's case is one that will be studied in criminology courses for years to come, not just for the brutality of the crime, but for the eerie precision of his actions. A criminology student who understood the mind of a killer, yet became one himself. A man who, in his chilling indifference, may have thought he was playing a game where the stakes were human lives. But the truth is far more complicated than any theory or study. It's a stark reminder that sometimes the most dangerous minds are those who have studied the darkness but fail to see it in themselves. This case leaves us with more questions than answers. How did someone who was supposed to understand the intricacies of the human psyche fall so far into darkness? What does this mean for our understanding of crime, justice, and the people behind it? The case of Bryan Kohberger will forever be a haunting reminder of the thin line between knowledge and madness, between the observer and the participant. But the story doesn't end here. If you thought this case was chilling, wait until you hear about the unsolved mystery of a disappearance that still haunts a small town. A case where the truth remains just beyond reach. Is it just another tragedy or something far more calculated? Stay tuned as we unravel more of these gripping tales of crime, mystery, and the human psyche. As we peel back the layers of this chilling case, one thing becomes clear. The deeper you dig, the more unsettling the truth becomes. It's a case that challenges everything we thought we knew about the psychology of crime, and the terrifying reality that it can be anyone, someone seemingly ordinary blending into the background of everyday life, who can become a monster. How does a mind like that form? How does someone who studies crime, study the very essence of evil, end up committing such an unthinkable act? And what was his motive? If you're as captivated as we are by the twists and turns of this case, hit that like button and help others discover this story. We've only just started scratching the surface. The journey to uncovering the truth is far from over. We're about to reveal a shocking new twist, one that will change everything you thought you knew about this case. Don't miss it. Subscribe now so you'll be the first to hear about the latest developments and upcoming revelations. As this story unfolds, the pieces of the puzzle begin to fall into place. What could possibly explain the horrifying events that took place in Moscow, Idaho? The evidence is mounting, but the deeper we look, the more questions arise. Stay with us until the end for more answers, and don't forget to share your thoughts in the comments below. What do you think? Was this a crime of opportunity? Or was there something darker at play here that we haven't uncovered yet? Thank you for watching. If you're as fascinated by these chilling true crime cases as we are, don't forget to subscribe for more riveting stories like this one. We'll see you soon as we continue to unravel the mystery of the most mind-bending cases that defy all logic.